Serena Vale smiled as she whispered into Luca Romano's ear, and in that single moment, without raising her voice, without drawing a weapon, without spilling a drop of blood, she destroyed a woman who had never done anything to her. That smile, that quiet, calculated smile of a woman who had spent years building a trap and was finally watching her prey walk into it. Elena Ashford was 31 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and holding an ultrasound photo in her coat pocket. When she heard the man she loved laugh and say another woman's name like it was the only name that had ever mattered, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply stopped breathing for 10 seconds, slipped her engagement ring off her finger, and walked out of that building carrying a secret Luca Romano would not discover for almost a year. If that were you, if the person you had given everything to had just handed your future to someone else, what would you have done? If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will make your jaw drop. The night Elena Ashford's life ended and began at the same time was an ordinary Tuesday in November. She remembered that detail later with a bitterness she couldn't quite shake. The fact that it was so unremarkable a day. No storm outside. No sense of dread that morning when she woke up. She had eaten cereal for breakfast, argued briefly with her sister over a borrowed sweater, and spent 20 minutes choosing which coat to wear because she wanted to look nice. She had wanted to look nice for him. That was the part that stayed with her longest. She had spent 20 minutes choosing a coat for a man who had already chosen someone else. Elena had been with Luca Romano for 5 years, and in that time, she had learned to love things about him that most people would have run from. She knew what he was. She had never pretended otherwise. I was the head of the Romano organization, a sprawling, decades-old network that moved money and favors and influence across 3 states with the kind of quiet efficiency that law enforcement had been trying to crack for years. He wasn't a street criminal. He wore custom suits and attended charity galas and shook hands with city councilmen. But Elena knew the difference between what Luca showed the world and what he actually was, and she had chosen to love him anyway. That choice had cost her sleep. It had cost her friendships. It had cost her a version of herself that used to believe everything could be simple. But it had also given her the kind of love she hadn't expected to survive outside of old movies. The arguing over coffee in the morning, the reaching for each other in the dark, the feeling that someone in this world actually knew your worst corners and stayed anyway. She had believed that. She had believed it completely. And she was still believing it when she stepped through the side entrance of the Romano building that Tuesday night, using the key code Luca had given her 2 years ago when he said she was the only person outside his blood family who would ever have it. She had come to surprise him. She had the ultrasound photo folded carefully inside her coat pocket, slightly creased at the corner because she had taken it out and put it back 4 times already that day, rehearsing the moment. She had imagined his face. She had imagined him going still for a moment, the way he did when something genuinely surprised him, that rare drop of the mask, and then imagined him reaching for her and pulling her in close. She had imagined it so many times that the imagined version felt almost like a memory. She was walking down the corridor toward his office when she heard the voices. She almost didn't stop. The hallway was long and the voices were low, and she was already thinking about the words she would use, already rehearsing the expression she wanted her face to make. But something made her slow. Some half-conscious awareness that the tone of what she was hearing was not professional. Not businesslike. Not the flat, efficient language Luca used when he was working. He was laughing. Not the polite performance laugh he used at meetings. The real one. The one she recognized from private mornings and late nights when no one else was around. Elena stopped 6 feet from the half-open door. "You know this is where you belong." The voice was Serena Vale's, smooth, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once sounded nervous in Elena's presence, which she had always told herself was simply confidence, simply professionalism, simply the manner of a woman who had grown up around power the same way Luca had. She heard Luca exhale. Not quite a laugh. Something warmer than that. "I know," he said. 2 words. Elena's hand found the wall. "She doesn't fit here." Serena again. Still that calm, settled voice, as if she were discussing something obvious that only needed to be spoken aloud. "She never did. You know that. You've known it for a long time." Silence. And then Luca said, "She's good. She's genuinely, she's a good woman." Elena felt her chest tighten, because the way he said it, the way he said she's a good woman, past the frame, outside the room, like describing someone he had already placed in his past without quite announcing it. "Good women don't survive this world," Serena said. "You've seen it. You know what happens to them. You care about her, so protect her the way she actually needs to be protected. Let her go build whatever quiet life she wants somewhere that isn't here." Another silence. Longer. "When this is done," Luca said slowly, "when the next 18 months are through and I have the organization exactly where I need it, you and I both know who ends up standing next to me, who's built for this." Serena's response was not words. Elena heard the faint shift of movement. She didn't need to see it. She stood in that corridor for a full 30 seconds, which felt like something much larger than 30 seconds. She became aware of her own heartbeat, the way you only do when something is happening to it. Her hand was still on the wall. The ultrasound photo was still in her pocket, still slightly creased at the corner. She thought about going in. She had a right to go in. She thought about what she would say. She tried on several versions of it, rapid and silent, and each one fell apart before she could use it. Because every version required her to believe that there was something in there worth salvaging, and in those 30 seconds, listening to Luca Romano agree that she didn't belong in his world, something inside her made a decision that her brain hadn't caught up to yet. She took her hand off the wall. She reached into her pocket and felt the ultrasound photo against her fingers. She kept it there. She reached into her other pocket and found the ring, the one he had placed on her finger 14 months ago in a restaurant where he had been visibly terrified, which she had loved about him. The fact that even a man who ran a criminal empire had been terrified to propose. She slid it off. She placed it in her coat pocket next to the ultrasound photo. And she walked back down the corridor, back through the side entrance, back into a night that looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago, except that everything was different. She didn't cry in the parking lot. She sat in her car for 4 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, and she made herself breathe slowly, and she did not cry. What she felt instead was something she had no immediate name for. It wasn't grief yet. It wasn't rage. It was something cooler and more complete than either. A strange, clarifying silence, as if her body had accepted something that her heart hadn't processed yet, and was quietly already beginning to plan. She drove to her sister's apartment. Her sister Rachel opened the door in pajamas and took one look at Elena's face and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was unusual for Rachel, who was congenitally incapable of silence in most situations. What happened? Not a question. Elena sat down on the couch and put her coat on the cushion beside her and stared at the middle distance for a moment. "I need you to help me disappear," she said. Rachel sat across from her, slowly. "Elena, not dramatically. I'm not in danger." She paused. "I don't think I'm in danger. I just need to not be here anymore. I need to be somewhere that isn't here, and I need it to happen quickly, and I need him not to be able to find me easily." She swallowed. "I need to think. I need somewhere to think that isn't his city." Rachel was quiet for another moment. Then, "How long have you been planning this?" "About 40 minutes." Rachel put her hand over her mouth briefly, pressed it there, took it away. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Tell me what you need." Elena reached into her coat pocket and took out the ultrasound photo and set it on the coffee table between them without explanation. Rachel looked at it for a long time. "Oh, Elena." "He doesn't know," Elena said. "And right now I need to keep it that way. I need to think clearly before I make any decisions about that, and I cannot think clearly within 100 miles of him." "What did he do?" Elena shook her head, not because she couldn't say it, but because saying it out loud right now would open something she needed to keep closed until she was somewhere safe. "Something I can't unhear," she said. Rachel didn't push. That was the thing about Rachel. She knew exactly when to push and exactly when to simply be a wall you could lean against. They spent the next 3 hours making a list. It wasn't a dramatic list. It wasn't elaborate. Elena had no interest in elaborate. She wanted simple. A new city. A sublease she could sign under her own name in a place where his reach didn't have the same depth. A job she could do remotely. A routine she could build from scratch. She had a modest savings account that was her own. Not tied to him. Not touched by him. She had been careful about that. Not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a conviction she'd always held that a woman should have something that was only hers. By 2 in the morning, they had the outline. By 3, Elena was in Rachel's spare room in the dark, lying on her back, one hand resting on her stomach, staring at a ceiling she had never paid much attention to before. Her phone had 3 missed calls from Luca. She turned it face down. She didn't delete the calls. She didn't block the number. She just placed it face down on the nightstand and lay there in the quiet and let herself feel, for the first time since the corridor, exactly what she felt. It hit her in waves. Not cleanly. Not as simple grief or simple anger, but as something tangled and overlapping, where the love was still completely present, which was maybe the worst part. She didn't stop loving him that night. She would have found it easier if she had. Instead, what she felt was love moving through a body that had just been informed it had no safe place to land, and that sensation, love with nowhere to go, was a specific kind of pain she had no previous framework for. She thought about the conversation she had imagined, the ultrasound photo, his face. She thought about you and I both know who ends up standing next to me. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach and made herself breathe. "I've got you," she whispered, not to herself. To the small beginning life that had no idea yet what kind of world it was being born into. She would figure the rest out later. What Elena did not know, what she could not have known from a corridor at the wrong angle, hearing a conversation designed to be overheard, was that the exchange she had witnessed was not spontaneous. Serena Vale was not a woman who said things spontaneously. She had worked on that conversation the way an architect works on structural load-bearing plans, testing the angles, calculating what would collapse and what would hold. She had known Elena would come that night. She had engineered it. The anonymous tip to Elena's calendar app, sent from a spoofed address, had suggested that Luca needed her there around 8. Serena had placed herself in his office at 7:55. She had kept the door open at precisely the angle that would let sound travel down the corridor but would not let Elena see inside clearly enough to read the room. The words themselves had been written and rewritten over several weeks, tested on models. She didn't know was an obvious choice, too accusatory. But she doesn't fit here. That was something different. That was the kind of sentence that didn't sound like an attack. It sounded like a sad, honest observation from a woman who cared about everyone involved. Serena Vale had been building this moment for 4 years. Not because she was obsessed with Luca Romano, or not only because of that, but because she had made a calculation early in her career that the Romano Empire's next chapter belonged to someone who understood it from the inside, and that the woman sleeping beside its head was a liability the organization couldn't survive. Elena was soft. Elena was decent. Elena asked questions. Serena was none of those things, and she was very good at waiting. What Serena had not calculated, what she could not have seen because she had not noticed Elena's coat pocket, had not seen the way Elena's hand pressed against her own abdomen twice during the preceding weeks, had not intercepted the appointment with the OB 3 days prior, was the variable that was about to make every piece of her plan more complicated than she had designed for. She had removed Elena from the board. She had not removed the child. Luca Romano did not realize Elena was gone until the following morning. He called. No answer. He called again, sent a message, drove to her apartment mid-morning and found it unlocked, her key on the kitchen counter, her personal items missing with the calm deliberateness of someone who had packed with intention rather than panic. He stood in her apartment for a long time. He called Rachel, who told him quietly that Elena was safe and that she needed space and that if he pushed, she would need more of it. He didn't push. Not yet. He was not a man who panicked visibly, and he told himself she would call. She was upset about something. She had misread something. She needed a few days, and she would call. He called 7 more times over the following 2 weeks. He composed and deleted 4 messages. He drove past her apartment twice, even though he knew she wasn't there. She did not call. And Luca Romano, who had controlled rooms full of dangerous men without showing a flicker of fear, sat in his car outside an empty apartment on a Tuesday night 4 weeks after she disappeared, and felt a helplessness so unfamiliar it was almost physical. The helplessness of a man who understood every kind of power except the kind that made someone simply choose to stop reaching back. He told himself he would give it time. He did not yet know that the clock he was measuring the wrong kind of time against. Somewhere in another state, under a quiet November sky, Elena Ashford was sitting in a small rented room she had already begun to make feel like something, with her hand on her stomach and a list of baby names she had not shared with anyone yet, making herself believe. Not easily, not all at once, but determinedly, the way you do things when you have no other option. That she could build something new from what was left. She could. She would. But the road between that quiet room and anything resembling peace was longer and more dangerous than she knew. And the woman who had engineered her disappearance was not done. She was, in fact, just getting started. Rachel Ashford was not a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up in the same house as Elena, which meant she had grown up learning how to read a room before she walked into it, how to gauge the temperature of silence, how to tell the difference between a person who was fine and a person who was performing fine. She had watched her sister fall in love with Luca Romano with the specific terror of someone who could see exactly what was happening and had no useful way to intervene. But the morning Elena showed up at her door with her ring in her coat pocket and an ultrasound photo in her hand, Rachel had made a decision that was not complicated at all. She chose her sister. She had been choosing her sister every day since. The new city was Portland, not because it was dramatic or far enough to feel like exile, but because Rachel had a contact there, a former colleague who managed a small property firm and could arrange a month-to-month lease without the kind of paper trail that would appear in the first round of searches. Elena had wanted ordinary. She had wanted a place where nobody knew what her last name used to mean. They found an apartment on the third floor of a converted building that smelled like old radiator heat and someone else's cooking. Elena stood in the empty living room on the first day and looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the window and said, "This is fine. This is exactly fine." Rachel didn't argue with her. She helped carry boxes. She assembled a second-hand crib that came with instructions missing 2 pages. She made grocery runs without being asked and stocked the refrigerator with things Elena hadn't requested but needed. Oranges, whole milk, crackers that weren't too heavily salted, the specific brand of ginger tea that helped with the nausea Elena had stopped mentioning because she was tired of hearing herself complain. "You don't have to stay," Elena told her one evening, sitting on the floor with her back against the couch, because the couch itself was still uncomfortable, still unfamiliar. "I know," Rachel said. "I mean it. You have your job. You have Marcus. Marcus can survive without me for 3 weeks. He's done it before." Rachel sat down beside her on the floor, which was something she would not normally have done because Rachel had strong opinions about floors being for objects and not for people. "And my job is remote until February, which I already told you." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Elena looked at her. "Why aren't you asking me more questions?" Rachel was quiet for a moment, then, "Because I know you. You'll tell me what I need to know when you're ready, and until then, asking questions is just going to make you spend energy on explaining instead of deciding. You need to decide things right now, not explain." Elena put her head back against the couch cushion and stared at the ceiling. "He called again," she said. "I know. I saw your phone. I almost picked up the 3rd time." Rachel didn't respond to that. She just sat there, which was the right response. "I can't pick up," Elena said. Not to Rachel, not really. More as a thing she needed to hear in her own voice to make it real. "Because if I pick up, I'm going to either tell him or not tell him, and both of those things right now are wrong. I need to be stable first. I need to have a floor under me before I have that conversation." "Then don't pick up," Rachel said. "Simple as that." "It's not simple. I know it's not simple. I said it like it was because sometimes that helps." Rachel turned to look at her. "Does it help?" Elena almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was closer than anything had been in 2 weeks. "A little," she said. "A little bit." That was November. This was the good part of the story. The part with the ginger tea and the second-hand crib and Rachel on the floor. The part before things got complicated in new ways. By December, Elena had a routine. She woke early because her body would not let her sleep past 6. Some prenatal clock she had no control over. She made coffee she could only drink half of before the smell turned on her, and she sat at the table by the window and watched the street below get light, and she wrote lists. She was a list maker by nature, always had been, but these lists were different from the ones before. These were not shopping lists or career lists or the meticulous planning documents she used to keep for the events she coordinated back in Chicago. These were quieter, more personal. Things I need before the baby comes. Things I need to figure out about insurance. Things I should know about single-parent leave in Oregon. Questions for the OB. She had found an OB through a clinic 3 miles from the apartment. She had given her real name because she wasn't hiding in any official sense. She was simply not advertising her location. And the doctor was a woman in her late 50s named Dr. Nguyen, who had the specific manner of someone who had seen enough of life to not be surprised by any of it, which Elena found enormously comforting. "You're 8 weeks in the first appointment," Dr. Nguyen said at the second visit, studying the chart. "No one came with you today either." "My sister was going to, but she had a work call." The doctor didn't push. "Everything looks healthy. You're keeping your fluids up. The nausea should start to ease off in the next few weeks, possibly sooner. The ginger tea helps." "Good. Keep using it." A pause. "Is the father in the picture?" Elena looked at the wall for a moment. "Not currently." Dr. Nguyen wrote something in the chart. "Is that a situation that's likely to change?" "I don't know yet." The doctor nodded, not with judgment, with the flat acceptance of a woman who had heard this specific sentence too many times to attach unnecessary drama to it. "Well, whatever you decide, make sure you have support around you. That's the practical piece. The rest of it you'll figure out as you go, same as everyone." Elena appreciated the absence of reassurance in that. She had gotten enough reassurance from well-meaning people in her life to last several years. What she wanted was someone to tell her the actual facts, and Dr. Nguyen gave her the actual facts. She was going to be fine. That was the fact. Fine didn't mean easy. It meant survivable. And Elena Ashford had survived things before. Back in Chicago, Luca Romano was not fine. He was functional. That was the correct word. He showed up to the meetings he needed to show up to. He made the decisions that needed to be made. He sat at the head of the table in rooms where men twice his age were still slightly afraid of him, and he managed that with the same flat competence that had always characterized how he operated. From the outside, nothing was wrong. Marco Vitali, his closest associate, not Serena, but Marco, who had been with the family for 19 years and had known Luca since he was a teenager making bad choices in expensive shoes, watched him across the table one morning in mid-December and said nothing for a long time. Then, "You look terrible." "Thank you, Marco." "I'm not being poetic. You look like a man who hasn't slept in 3 weeks." "I've slept." "A man who hasn't slept well in 3 weeks." Luca looked up from the documents in front of him. "What do you want to say?" Marco put down his coffee. He was a large man, not fat but dense, with the kind of face that had never been particularly handsome but had become more interesting with age. He said, "I want to say that whatever happened with Elena, it's eating you alive, and you're letting it eat you alive instead of doing something about it. She doesn't want to be contacted." "Her sister told you that?" "Her sister told me that she needed space. That's the same thing." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Is it?" "Don't." "I'm not doing anything. I asked a question." Luca pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window. This was something he did when he didn't want his face read, and Marco had long since learned to simply wait when Luca went to a window. "She took everything that was hers," Luca said finally, not in anger, not in a rush. "She took only the things that were specifically hers, and she left the rest exactly as it was, and she put her key on the kitchen counter." He stopped. "That's not someone who left in a moment of anger. That's someone who made a decision." "People make decisions when they're in pain," Marco said. "That doesn't always mean the decision is permanent." "She's not answering my calls." "Then go there." "Her sister said—" "Her sister is protecting her." Marco's voice was not gentle, but it was not unkind. "That's what sisters do. It doesn't mean Elena doesn't want to hear from you. It means she's scared of what hearing from you will do to her, which is different." Luca turned from the window. "She's gone, Marco." "You don't know that." "I know it." His voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something older than both. "I know it the way you know certain things. I don't know what I did. I've gone over every conversation we had in the last 6 months, and I cannot find the moment it broke, but it broke, and she decided not to show me where. And I have to respect that." Marco looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly. "Not immediately, but you will." Luca sat back down and picked up the documents. "Get me the quarterly from Serena's division," he said. "I need to look at the Eastern accounts before Thursday." Marco said nothing else. He left. Serena brought the quarterly herself, which she often did, because she had been engineering small reasons to be in Luca's space for years, and was now simply continuing to do so with slightly less friction in the room. She set the documents on his desk and sat across from him without being invited, which was a thing she had earned the right to do over time through sheer consistency of presence. "You should eat something," she said. "So I'm told." "Marco's worried about you." "Marco's always worried about something. It's his function." Serena smiled. "Not big, just the corners." "She's not coming back, Luca." He looked up. "I know that's hard to hear," she said, and her voice was perfectly calibrated. Concern, but not excessive, not performative. The voice of someone who cared and was also simply being honest. "But you need to start accepting it so you can move forward. The organization needs you present, not halfway somewhere else." "I'm present." "You're operational. That's not the same." She leaned forward slightly. "You built something real here. Don't let it erode because of someone who decided she didn't want to be part of it anymore." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression that she read as agreement, because she needed it to be agreement, because she had spent 4 years reading his expressions and calibrating her responses to what she found there. She was almost right about this one. Almost. What she missed, what she had been missing for months, because Serena Vale was brilliant at strategy and poor at anything that required actual feeling, was that the way Luca was looking at her was not agreement. It was the specific, quiet assessment of a man who was beginning, slowly and without clear evidence, to feel that something in the room was not the shape it appeared to be. He didn't know why yet. He had no specific thread to pull. But it was there, the beginning of it. "Thank you for the quarterly," he said. Serena stood. "Of course." She moved toward the door, paused. "Get some sleep. You look awful." Marco said the same thing. "Marco's right." And she left. Luca sat with the quarterly untouched in front of him and stared at the doorway she had just walked through. "She's not coming back, Luca." He turned that sentence over. Not the content of it. That was what it appeared to be, sympathetic and direct. It was something else. The timing of it. The fact that she had said it specifically now, specifically unprompted, with the specific tone of someone delivering a conclusion they had been holding on to for a while. He let it go. He picked up the quarterly. But he didn't forget. January arrived with a week of snow that turned the city gray and ugly and made the streets feel smaller. Luca had always disliked January. Too much time to think, not enough activity to absorb it. He was in the building's administrative archive 3 weeks into the new year, not for any dramatic reason, but because he was looking for a paper contract from 2019 that had been incorrectly filed and that he needed for a legal review. I was going through the filing cabinet himself because his assistant had gotten the wrong box twice, and he didn't have patience left for a third attempt. He found the contract in the third drawer. He also found, 3 folders behind it, a manila envelope that had been misfiled. Not maliciously, just incorrectly, the way things get misfiled in organizations where paper still moves alongside digital. And that had Elena Ashford's name written on the tab in the neat administrative handwriting of someone in his medical liaison office. He should have returned it to the correct filing location and kept going. He opened it instead. It was a forwarded copy of a prenatal medical record. A routine administrative thing. His organization maintained health insurance for all primary family members, including partners of senior figures, and routine records sometimes passed through the office for insurance processing. He had never paid attention to this system because he had no reason to. The date at the top was November 3rd. The record was from an OB clinic in Chicago. It documented a first prenatal appointment, 8 weeks gestation, routine blood work, expected delivery the following July. November 3rd. He stood in the archive with the paper in his hands and the fluorescent light buzzing above him, and he did the arithmetic that took almost no time at all. 8 weeks in November, July delivery. She had walked into this building in early November. He had seen her on the security footage later, the timestamp, the side entrance, and she had walked back out, and he had never understood why. He had spent months not understanding why. Now he was beginning to. He sat down on the floor of the archive. Not gracefully. He just sat down because his legs made a decision without his input, and he sat there with the medical record in his hands and stared at a filing cabinet he was no longer seeing. She had been pregnant. She had come here pregnant, and she had left, and she had not told him. He stayed on that floor for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch at the beginning and again at the end, not for any purpose, but because his mind was looking for something concrete to anchor to, and the watch was what was available. Then he stood up, put the folder in his jacket, and went to find Marco. Marco took one look at his face and closed the office door. "Sit down," Marco said. "She was pregnant." Luca held out the folder. "When she left, she was already pregnant." Marco took the folder. "Read it." His expression went through several things in rapid succession that he did not entirely succeed in controlling. "Luca, she came here that night. The security log. I looked at it months ago. I thought she had changed her mind about coming in. But she came in and she left, and she had this." He pressed his hand flat on the document Marco was holding. "She had this in her pocket, and she walked out and never told me." "You don't know that she had it with her. She had her first appointment that morning. You think she wasn't carrying it?" His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it steady. "She was 8 weeks pregnant, and she came here and something happened, and she left, and she didn't tell me." "What could have happened?" Marco said carefully. Luca went to the window again, the gray January street below. "I don't know." "Think." "I am thinking." "Think harder." Marco's voice was firmer than usual. "You know this woman. You know how she makes decisions. Elena doesn't run from things without a reason, and the reason was something that happened here, in this building, that night. So think about what could have made her, a woman who is carrying your child and came here specifically to tell you, leave without saying a single word." The silence stretched. "I need the security footage from that night," Luca said. "From which camera?" "All of them. Every corridor she could have walked through between the side entrance and my office." Marco made a call without further discussion. It took 2 hours to pull and review the relevant footage. Luca sat in front of a monitor in the security room and watched Elena walk through the side entrance at 7:52, her coat buttoned, her pace deliberate. She walked to the east corridor. She slowed. She stopped outside his office door. He had been in that office at 7:52. He had been in that office with Serena. He watched Elena stand in the corridor for 31 seconds. He watched her hand find the wall. He watched her reach into her pocket. He watched her remove her ring. He watched her walk back the way she came. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and his breathing at approximately half its normal rate. Marco, standing behind him, said nothing. Luca replayed the 31 seconds, then again, then a third time, watching her hand on the wall, watching her face in the partial profile the camera caught, not clearly enough to read, but clearly enough to see that she was not crying, which was somehow worse than if she had been. "What were you saying?" Marco said quietly. "In that office, at 7:52. Luca didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Serena sitting across from him that evening. He was thinking about what she had said and what he had said in response. He was thinking about the door that he had left open. He couldn't remember why. He never left that door open, but that night it had been open and he had been talking and Serena had been talking and Elena had been 31 seconds in the corridor. And then he was thinking about something else. Something earlier. The thing that had been nagging at him for weeks without a name. "She's not coming back, Luca," said in January. Said specifically, presciently, with the tone of someone who already knew the conclusion before they stated it. Sighed by Serena Vale, who had been in his office the night Elena disappeared, with the door open. He pushed back from the monitor and stood up. His jaw was tight in the specific way that Marco had learned to recognize over 19 years as a sign that something very controlled was about to be put under significant strain. "I need you to do something for me," Luca said, quietly, without going through any channel that Serena has ever touched. Marco straightened slightly. "What?" "I need you to find Elena." He said it flatly. Not with drama. The way you say a thing when you have already moved past the emotional part of the decision and into the operational part. Whatever she's calling herself, wherever she is, however she arranged the disappearance. I need a location. She doesn't want to be found. I know. His voice didn't waver. Find her anyway. I'm not going there to drag her back. I'm going there because she is carrying my child in a city I don't know, and she thinks I chose someone else, and she's wrong. And she deserves to know she's wrong, even if she still doesn't want me after she hears it. Marco looked at him for a long moment. And Serena? he said. Luca picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Don't touch her, he said. Not yet. I need to know exactly what she did before I do anything about it. And I'm not doing anything until Elena and the baby are safe and out of reach of whatever this turns into. He paused at the door. But find me everything. Every communication she sent, every account she has access to, every person she's contacted in the last 5 years. I want to know the exact shape of what she built. That's going to take time. I have time. He looked back at Marco. What I don't have is another day of not knowing where she is. Marco nodded once. The search began that afternoon. It was a quiet, careful, methodical search. Not the kind that announced itself, not the kind that left marks. Marco used 3 layers of separation between his inquiries and anything that could be traced back to Romano resources. He pulled in 2 people he personally trusted, which was a short list, and gave them nothing more than they needed. It took 11 days. On the 12th day of February, Marco came into Luca's office and closed the door and put a single sheet of paper on the desk. Portland, Oregon. An address. A name. She was using her mother's maiden name, which was sensible and which Marco had respected in the report by not providing the full identity document, only the address. A note at the bottom that said, "She's healthy, the pregnancy is progressing, she has her sister with her." Luca sat with the paper for a long time. He thought about Rachel, who had told him Elena needed space and who had known all along and had chosen, correctly, her sister. He thought about the ultrasound photo he had never seen. He thought about Elena standing in the corridor with her hand on the wall and her ring coming off her finger. And he thought about the fact that in all the months since, she had not reached out once, not to correct him, not to explain, not even to be angry. And the silence of that was the most damning thing in the room, because Elena Ashford was not a woman who went quiet unless she was very, very sure. She was sure she had seen the truth, she had seen something, and she had believed it, and she had rebuilt her entire life around it being true. He thought about Serena saying, "She doesn't fit here," with the door open at the exact right angle. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket, and then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it, but something, instinct, the specific anxiety of a man who has just started pulling on a thread and knows the thing attached to it is larger than he expected, made him pick up. The voice on the other end was a man he knew distantly, a mid-level figure in the organization's financial division, a man named Curtis, who had always been quiet and competent and invisible in exactly the way that such men are invisible until they're not. "I need to tell you something," Curtis said. He sounded like a man who had been deciding to make this call for several days and had finally stopped debating it. "I'm not doing this because I'm loyal. I'm doing it because I'm scared and I want out, and I figure if I tell you first, I have more options." Luca said nothing. He waited. "Serena Vale has been in contact with a federal investigator," Curtis said. "Not officially, unofficially. She's been feeding them information about the organization's Eastern accounts for about 8 months. A pause. "But that's not the part you need to know right now." Another pause. Longer. "The part you need to know is that 2 days ago, she asked me to pull the residential records on someone in Portland, Oregon. She said it was a personal matter. She said she needed an address." The room went very quiet. "Did you pull it?" Luca said. Curtis hesitated. "Yes." "Whose address?" The name Curtis gave was Elena's current alias. Luca was on his feet before the call ended. He didn't remember standing. He was simply standing, and his hand was pressing the phone against his ear hard enough to hurt. And the paper with Portland on it was in his jacket, and something that had been a slow, cold awareness in the back of his mind for weeks had just become something immediate and without any safe distance left in it at all. Serena knew where Elena was, and whatever she intended to do with that information, she had already started. There was no longer any version of this where he waited. 3 calls in 4 minutes. The first was to Marco. He didn't explain. He said, "Get 2 people to Portland tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. I need eyes on the address, and I need them quiet." He gave Marco the address from the paper in his pocket, the one with Elena's name on it, and he listened to Marco absorb this without panic, because Marco was constitutionally incapable of panic, and that was exactly why Luca had kept him close for 19 years. "How much trouble?" Marco said. "Enough." "Understood." The second call was to his attorney, not the organization's attorney, but his personal one, a woman named Diane Holt, who had represented him in private matters twice before, and who knew the difference between what she needed to know and what she didn't. He told her to clear her mourning. She asked why. He said he needed to understand exactly what a voluntary disclosure to federal investigators looked like, and what it protected and what it didn't. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant conversation," she said. "I know what it is." "Luca, clear your mourning, Diane." She said she would. The third call he didn't make. He picked up his phone and looked at Elena's number. The old one. The one he had never deleted. The one that had rung 11 times in November into silence. And he put the phone face down on the desk and stood there with his hands pressed flat on the surface and breathed for a moment. Not yet. He could not call her yet. Not until he knew what Serena had already done. Not until he knew the exact dimensions of the danger, because if he called Elena right now and told her she might be in danger, and then it turned out Serena had only pulled the address for reconnaissance, he would have terrified a pregnant woman for nothing. And if he called Elena right now and told her the truth about everything, about November, about what he now understood she had overheard, about all of it, the conversation would take everything both of them had, and he needed her to be somewhere safe and stable for it, not blindsided in a Portland apartment at 10 in the evening. He needed information first. He needed the full shape of it. He needed to know what Serena Vale had actually built. He found out over the next 72 hours, and it was worse than he had assumed, which was saying something because he had assumed it was bad. Marco's people reached Portland by midnight and established a quiet presence near the apartment building without making contact. They reported back that the building was ordinary, the neighborhood was calm, and as of that evening there was no visible surveillance on the address and no indication of active interest. That bought time. Not much, but some. The information on Serena came from 3 directions simultaneously, which was the only reason the full picture assembled as quickly as it did. Curtis, the financial division man who had made the call, came into Marco's office the following morning looking like he hadn't slept. He sat down and spent 2 hours going through everything he knew, which turned out to be considerably more than Luca had expected from a man who presented as invisible. Curtis had been, for the past year and a half, functioning as a mid-tier conduit for funds that Serena was moving through channels that were technically connected to the organization, but were structured in a way that would, under a sufficiently determined forensic review, appear to be controlled exclusively by Luca's personal authorization. She had been signing his name. Not literally. But in the digital architecture of the transactions, the authorization trail led to Luca and stopped there, and Serena's fingerprints were behind so many layers of separation that only someone who already knew to look would find them. "How long?" Luca said. "Best I can trace, about 2 years. Curtis looked at the floor. "Maybe longer on the planning. The execution started about 2 years ago." Marco was standing by the window. He turned and looked at Luca with an expression that said several things simultaneously without using any words. "She was building a case against me," Luca said. Not a question. He was simply saying it aloud because the shape of it required saying. "She was building a case she could hand to the right person at the right moment," Curtis said. "Federal investigators, internal rivals, whoever was most useful. The way it's structured, if it ever gets formally examined, it looks like you were running a private skimming operation off your own organization for personal enrichment. It looks like you were stealing from your own people." The room was quiet. "Which means," Marco said carefully, "that she has the organization's internal loyalists as potential weapons too. Anyone who believes the framing would see Luca as a traitor to his own family." Curtis nodded. Luca sat back in his chair. He felt something he rarely felt, which was the specific cold of a situation that had been in motion for a long time without his knowledge. A machine that had been running in the dark while he was standing in the light, believing he understood his own environment. It was the feeling of having been comprehensively outmaneuvered, and it was not a feeling he had much experience with, and it sat in his chest like a stone. "Get out," he told Curtis. Not unkindly. "Not of the city, just out of this building. Go somewhere you'd normally go and do not contact Serena and do not tell anyone you were here." Curtis stood. "And me? What happens to me?" "Right now you're the most useful person in my orbit. That protects you. Stay useful." Luca met his eyes. "And Curtis, if you're lying to me about any part of this, useful stops protecting you very quickly." Curtis left. He believed it. He should have. The second direction was a woman named Petra, who had worked in Serena's administrative office for 3 years before being quietly transferred out 6 months ago for reasons that had been explained to Luca as a personnel restructuring. Petra had not appeared relevant at the time. She appeared very relevant now. Marco tracked her down through a third party, and she agreed to speak, not at the office and not anywhere Serena might have coverage. They met in a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away, and she sat across from Marco with her hands wrapped around a cup. She wasn't drinking and told him things in a low voice that she had been holding for months. The anonymous messages to Elena. Petra hadn't sent them. She was careful to establish that. But she had seen the drafting of them. Digital messages sent from spoofed accounts, untraceable on the surface, but routed through a system she had peripheral access to. Messages that appeared to come from within Luca's organization. Messages that suggested, subtly and without explicit accusation, that Elena was being discussed as a liability by the people closest to Luca. That her presence was considered a weakness. That the men around him found her naive, found her soft, found her presence a source of private amusement. How long was she sending them? Marco asked. Petra thought, I saw the first one about 3 years ago. Maybe earlier than that, and I just didn't see it. 3 years. For 3 years, Serena had been delivering a slow, invisible drip of psychological erosion into Elena's inbox. And Elena, who had never mentioned this to Luca, because Elena had probably told herself she was being paranoid, or because Elena had too much pride to bring him insecurities she couldn't prove, had been absorbing it in silence. Marco called Luca from the parking lot of the coffee shop, standing between 2 cars with the rain coming down. 3 years, he said. Luca was silent on the other end for a moment. She had 3 years of groundwork before November, Marco continued. The messages were designed to make Elena believe she was being tolerated rather than chosen, that the people around you considered her temporary. By the time she walked into that building and heard that conversation, she was already primed to believe it. The conversation was staged, Luca said. Flat, certain. Has to have been. The door being open, the timing. The specific language Serena used. She didn't say she wanted you. She said Elena didn't belong. That's not a woman flirting. That's a woman delivering a conclusion to an audience. And my part in it? Marco paused. You said enough. There it was. The part that Luca had been sitting with since the archive. The part that no amount of Serena's engineering could fully absorb. Because whatever she had staged, he had still stood in that office and spoken words that an 8 weeks pregnant woman had heard through an open door and found sufficient reason to remove her ring and walk out of his life. He had said enough. I know, he said quietly. Whatever you said, she built the stage for it. She needed you to say the right words at the right moment, and she arranged the conditions for it. I know that too. A pause. It doesn't entirely matter. The words were still mine. Marco didn't argue with him. It wasn't an argument anyone could win. The third direction came from an unlikely source, Luca's own mother. Rosa Romano was 71 years old, had been widowed for 12 years, and had long since retired from any active role in the organization, which she had always regarded with a pragmatic understanding that stopped well short of approval. She lived in a house in the northern suburbs and kept a garden she took seriously, and had opinions about everything that she expressed without particular regard for whether her opinions were welcome. Luca drove to her house on the second day, without calling ahead, and she opened the door and looked at his face and said, "Come in and eat something before you say whatever you came to say." He ate half a bowl of soup standing up at her kitchen counter, which was not how she preferred people to eat in her kitchen, but she let it go because she could see he was not in a state to sit. "Serena Vale," he said. His mother set down her coffee mug. "What about her? How long have you known her?" Rosa's expression shifted in a small way. Not guilty, but careful. "She came into the organization about 6 years ago. You know that." "I know when she arrived. I'm asking how long you've known her." A pause. "We'd met before. Her family had some connection to the Ferrante side. I knew her father marginally." "You never told me that." "You never asked." She picked up her coffee mug again. "Is it relevant? Did you ever speak to her about Elena?" His mother was quiet, the kind of quiet that was its own answer. "Mom, I may have expressed at some point concerns about..." "What concerns?" "Luca, what did you tell her?" His voice was level, but there was nothing soft in it. "Specifically." Rosa Romano set her coffee down again and looked at her son with the expression of a woman who was doing a rapid internal audit and not entirely satisfied with the results. I told her that I thought Elena was a good person, a genuinely good person, but that I wasn't certain she had the temperament for the life, that I worried about what the life would do to her over time. She paused. And that I thought, if Luca were honest with himself, he knew it too. The kitchen was very quiet. You told Serena Vale that I knew Elena wasn't built for this life. I was speaking privately. I didn't think you handed her the script. His voice didn't rise. That was almost worse. She needed to know exactly what I would say if the right words were said to me, in the right room, at the right moment, and you gave her the roadmap. Rosa's face went through something complicated. I didn't know she would use it. No, you didn't know. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I'm not blaming you for what she did with it. But I need you to understand the full shape of what happened, because Elena heard me say the things Serena needed me to say, in a room Serena made sure was accessible, in a conversation Serena designed using a map you provided, and then Elena left this city pregnant and alone because she believed I had already decided she wasn't enough. His mother was very still. She was pregnant, she said. 8 weeks when she left. He picked up his keys. I found out 4 days ago. Rosa Romano was not a woman who cried easily. She sat at her kitchen table and pressed her lips together and said nothing for a long moment. Is she? She's safe. The baby is safe. He moved toward the door. I'm going to fix this. But I needed to know the full shape of it first, and now I do. He left without looking back. Not because he was cruel, but because he had no more room right now for anyone else's guilt. He was carrying enough of his own. He was on the highway back to the city when Marco called. We have a problem, Marco said. The words landed with a specific weight that Luca recognized. Not a small problem, not a logistical complication. The kind of problem that preceded Marco's voice taking on that particular stripped-down quality, the one that appeared when things required immediate action rather than deliberation. Tell me. Serena called a meeting this morning. Organizational leadership, Eastern Division heads, 3 of the financial controllers. She told them she needed to present findings from an internal audit. She doesn't run audits. She ran this one. Marco's breathing was steady but quick. Luca, she's moving. Whatever timeline she had, she's accelerated it. She presented documentation to those men this morning that showed a pattern of unauthorized transfers out of the Eastern accounts over the past 2 years. Documentation that was attributed to your authorization codes. The highway stretched ahead, flat and gray and indifferent. How did the room respond? Luca asked. Mixed. 2 of the controllers looked shocked. One of the division heads, Caruso. He didn't look shocked. He looked like he'd been expecting it. A pause. Which means she already had him. Which means this wasn't her first conversation with Caruso. This was her making it official. Caruso. Luca filed that. She's not trying to hand me to the federal investigators first, Luca said. It was coming together as he spoke, the full architecture of it becoming visible now that he had enough of the pieces. She's taking the organization first. If she controls the internal narrative before the federal case formally opens, she has leverage over how the whole thing falls. She hands the feds a version of events where she's a witness and I'm the target, and she already has organizational support because she spent 2 days making the case to the people who matter. That's how I read it, Marco said. Who was in that room that she doesn't already have? Benedetti, possibly Pharaoh. I'd need to confirm. Get to them before she gets back to them. Don't tell them anything specific. Just tell them to hold before they make any commitments. He checked his mirror and moved lanes. And the federal angle. I need Diane today. Not tomorrow. Today. She'll push back on the timeline. Tell her what I told her before. Then tell her it just became more urgent. He ended the call and drove in silence for approximately 90 seconds, which was the amount of time he allowed himself to sit inside the full weight of it. She had been building this for 4 years, maybe longer. She had engineered the removal of Elena. She had constructed a financial frame that implicated him in crimes he hadn't committed. She had cultivated loyalties within his own organization. She had made preliminary contact with federal investigators. And she had now moved the public phase of it forward, which meant she believed she had enough to survive whatever response he mounted. She believed she had already won. He thought about that. He turned it over carefully, the way you handle something you intend to use. She believed she had won. And the reason she believed it was that for 4 years she had been the most intelligent person in every room she entered, and no one had known to look for her, and the evidence she had constructed was real enough to withstand a surface examination. What she hadn't calculated, what she couldn't have calculated, because it required a combination of events that no amount of forward planning could have predicted, was that a misfiled manila envelope in an administrative archive was going to put Luca Romano on the floor of that room, staring at a prenatal record dated November 3rd, and that staring at that record was going to make him pull every thread he had ignored for months, and that Curtis was going to make a phone call out of fear, and that Petra was going to talk to Marco in a parking lot in the rain. She had built a perfect machine. She had not accounted for the misfiled envelope. Luca reached the city, pulled off the highway, and made the call he had been holding. Not Marco. Not Diane. He dialed Rachel Ashford's number. She picked up on the third ring, which told him she'd seen the name and spent 2 rings deciding. Luca. Rachel. He pulled into a parking structure and stopped the car. I'm not calling to pressure her. I need you to listen to me for 3 minutes. A long pause. I'm listening. She's in danger, not from me. From someone who has spent 4 years systematically working to remove her from my life and is now in a phase of this that has become dangerous to everyone connected to me. He kept his voice even. Clinical. He needed Rachel to hear information, not emotion. I have people near the apartment. They're not a threat to her. They're watching the building. But I need Elena to know what's happening, and I need to know she's prepared to move if I tell her to move. Silence. Rachel. She just had the baby, Rachel said. He stopped. The parking structure was concrete and gray and very quiet. What? She wasn't due until July. Rachel's voice had something in it that was tired and careful and several other things at once. He came early, 5 weeks early. He's been in the NICU for 3 days, Luca. He's okay. They say he's going to be completely okay. But Elena has been sleeping in a chair next to an incubator, and she hasn't eaten a real meal since Saturday, and she doesn't know any of what you just told me. Luca sat in his car in a concrete parking structure and held his phone against his ear, and for a moment he could not locate a single word. His son. He had a son who was 3 days old and was in a hospital incubator in Portland, and who had arrived into the world 5 weeks ahead of schedule, while his father was 2 states away learning the shape of a betrayal. What hospital? He said. Luca, Rachel. What hospital? She told him. She said it in the tone of a woman who had already decided to say it before he asked, which meant some part of her had known, when she picked up the phone, that this was where the call was going. Is she okay? He said. His voice did something at the end of that sentence that he didn't entirely control. She's exhausted. She's scared. But she's okay. A pause. He's small. He's really small, Luca. But the doctors say he's strong. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Tell her I'm coming, he said. Not to ask her permission, just to tell her. She can be angry at me when I get there. She can say anything she wants to me when I get there. But tell her I'm coming because she needs to know that when I walk in there, it's not a surprise. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I'll tell her, she said. He was on a flight to Portland 4 hours later, in a window seat with a carry-on bag he'd packed in 11 minutes, with Diane's voice in his earpiece going through the preliminary structure of a voluntary disclosure conversation, while he stared at the cloud cover below and thought about a child he had never seen, in a hospital he had never been to, with a woman who had every reason to close the door in his face. The flight took 2 hours and 40 minutes. He did not sleep. He did not eat the thing the flight attendant offered him. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the window, and he thought about Elena standing in a corridor with her hand on the wall, and he thought about how long she had been handling this alone, and he thought about the 3 days she had spent sleeping in a chair next to an incubator while he was still 2 states away. And he felt the full weight of that, not abstractly but physically, in his chest and his throat and the backs of his hands, the weight of everything he had missed, and everything that had been taken from him by someone he had trusted, and everything he had allowed by not looking closely enough at the room he was standing in. He thought about what Rachel had said. He's really small. He pressed his hand flat against the window and kept it there until the cold of it grounded him back into the immediate, into the present, into the single manageable fact of what came next. He landed at 10:12 at night. He did not go to a hotel. He took a car directly from the airport and arrived at the hospital at 11:03 and stood in the lobby for a moment, adjusting to the fluorescent light and the antiseptic smell and the ordinary humming aliveness of a hospital at night. He went to the NICU floor. He stopped at the nurse's station and gave his name and said he was here to see Elena Ashford, and the nurse checked something and made a brief call and said, "She said you can come back." He walked down a corridor that felt about twice as long as it was. He pushed open a door. Elena was sitting in a chair beside an incubator. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt he didn't recognize, and her hair was up in the loose, careless way she did it when she wasn't thinking about it. She had a paper coffee cup on the floor beside her chair and a blanket across her lap that she wasn't using as much as resting her hands on. She looked like someone who had been awake for too long in a place that was simultaneously terrifying and sacred, which was exactly what she was. She looked up when he came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He looked at the incubator, at the small, fierce presence inside it, tiny hands. A face so new it seemed barely finished, wires and monitors and a small knit hat over a head that fit in the palm of a hand. Luca Romano stood in the doorway of a NICU room in Portland, Oregon, looking at his son for the first time, and whatever composure he had been managing for the last 4 hours came apart, just slightly, just at the edges, in a way that anyone watching might not have noticed, but that Elena, who had spent 5 years learning the geography of his face, noticed immediately. He didn't cry. He wasn't built for that in public, not even here, not even now. But something moved through him that was visible in the set of his jaw and the way he stopped in the doorway and simply looked and didn't try to make it get anything other than what it was. "His name is Daniel," Elena said. Her voice was flat and careful. Not cold exactly. The voice of someone who had used up everything available for warmth on the small person in the incubator and had a limited reserve left for anyone else. Luca nodded. He didn't move from the doorway yet. "Daniel," he repeated, like he was fitting it into a space that had been empty. "You can come in," she said. Not warmly, but she said it. He crossed the room and stood beside the incubator and looked at his son for a long time without speaking, and Elena watched him do it with her hands flat on the blanket across her lap, and her expression doing something complicated that she didn't entirely have control of, because whatever she felt about Luca Romano, and what she felt was still tangled and unresolved and shot through with a grief that had not finished moving through her. Watching him see Daniel for the first time was not something she could be entirely hard against. "He's strong," she said finally. "The doctors keep saying he's strong." "He looks it," Luca said. His voice was low, something private in it. They stayed like that for several minutes, the two of them on either side of the incubator with Daniel between them, the monitors beeping in their steady mechanical rhythm, the corridor sounds muffled beyond the door. Then Luca said, "I need to tell you some things." "I know." "Not tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight I just needed to be here. The rest of it can wait until you've slept." Elena looked at him for a moment. The exhaustion in her face was total, not just physical, but the kind that comes from weeks of sustained fear and isolation, from making every decision alone, from sleeping in a chair beside a machine, keeping watch over someone you love more than you've loved anything. "Okay," she said. Not forgiveness, not welcome. Just, okay. He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down on the other side of the incubator, and they spent the rest of that night in the same room without speaking much, and that was where things stood when morning came. The morning brought Diane Holt. She arrived at the hospital at 8:15, which meant she had been on a flight or in a car most of the night, which told Luca something about how seriously she was taking this. She was a small woman in her early 60s with silver hair. She kept short in a manner that was precise without being cold. The manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where imprecision cost people things they couldn't get back. She found Luca in the corridor outside the NICU, and she looked at him with the assessment of someone cataloging damage. "You look terrible," she said. "That's the consensus." "Is the child stable?" "The doctors say he's improving. Yes." "Good." She put her briefcase down and stood in front of him. "Then let's talk about what's happening in Chicago, because it moved overnight." It had moved significantly. While Luca had been on a plane to Portland, Serena had made contact with the federal investigators she'd been feeding information to for 8 months. Not just feeding anymore. She had formally opened a proffer conversation through her own attorney which was the process by which a potential witness offers cooperation in exchange for consideration. She was telling the investigators she had documented evidence of financial crimes committed by Luca Romano, and she was offering to deliver it in exchange for immunity. She filed the proffer last night, Luca said. Initiated it. It's not formal yet, but it will be within 48 hours if nothing interrupts it. Diane's voice was measured. Once that becomes formal, the investigators open an official inquiry and your options narrow significantly. You become reactive instead of active. What does active look like right now? It looks like you initiating contact with the same office before she does. Voluntary disclosure. You come to them with what you have about the fraudulent transaction structure. You demonstrate that you have documentation of who actually constructed it, and you position yourself as a cooperating party rather than a target. She paused. But it requires moving in the next 24 hours, maybe less. If I do that, what's the exposure? On the legitimate business dismantling, manageable with the right structure. On the historical organization operations? She leveled her gaze at him. There will be exposure, I won't pretend otherwise. But the difference between coming to them first with documentation of a fraud committed against you and being named as a target in someone else's proffer is the difference between a negotiated outcome and a prosecutorial one. Luca looked at the door to the NICU. My son is in there, he said. I know. He's 5 weeks early and he's been in an incubator for 4 days and his mother has been alone in this city since November. He wasn't saying it for sympathy. He was saying it because it was the frame everything else had to fit inside. Whatever I do in the next 24 hours has to account for that. I understand. Diane picked up her briefcase. But Luca, you cannot protect them from Portland. You need to resolve this in Chicago, and you need to do it before Serena's proffer formalizes, and you need to do it while you still have leverage over the shape of the narrative. She met his eyes. I need a decision. He looked at the door one more time. Make the call, he said. Set it up. I need 4 hours with Elena first, and then I'll be on a plane. Diane nodded and walked toward the elevator, already with her phone at her ear. Luca went back through the NICU door. Elena was awake. She had moved her chair closer to the incubator and had one hand through the portal opening, her fingers resting lightly against Daniel's arm in the instinctive, continuous contact of a new mother who needed to be touching him at all times to confirm he was real and warm and present. She looked up when Luca came in. Sit down, she said. He sat. She took her hand back from the incubator slowly, reluctantly, and folded both hands in her lap and looked at him with the clear, direct, exhausted gaze of a woman who had been rehearsing this conversation in some form for months and was now simply ready to have it. Tell me, she said. He told her everything. He started with the archive, the misfiled envelope. He told her what the record said and what it meant and how long he had sat on the floor of that room doing arithmetic. He told her about the security footage, about watching her in the corridor for 31 seconds. He told her about Curtis and what Curtis had shown them about the financial architecture Serena had constructed. He told her about Petra and the anonymous messages, 3 years of them. And he watched Elena's face go through something he could not fully read, but that involved a long exhale and her eyes closing for a moment, as if a thing she had half suspected but never been able to confirm had just been handed to her as fact. I thought I was going crazy, she said quietly. You weren't. I knew some of them were. I suspected they were manufactured. They were too precisely painful. They knew exactly which insecurities to press. She looked at her hands. But I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't tell you because if I told you and you thought I was being paranoid, it would have confirmed exactly what the messages were saying, that I wasn't built for the world you were in, that I was too soft for it. Elena, let me finish. Not harshly. I want to say it out loud while I still have the nerve. She looked up at him. The night I came in, I heard you say I don't belong in your world, and I heard you say you knew who would be standing next to you when everything was settled. And I believed it because I had been given 3 years of preparation to believe it. She paused. I know now that it was staged. I understand the mechanism of it. But I also need you to understand that the words came out of your mouth, Luca. Serena built the stage, but you spoke the lines. I know. I need to hear that you know, not as a concession, as a fact you've actually sat with. I have sat with it. His voice was even, but not easy. I had a conversation I shouldn't have had in an open room with someone I should have been watching more carefully, about a woman I should have been. I should have been talking to, not about. And whatever Serena's role in it was, that part is mine. I said what I said. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Not everything, just that piece, acknowledged. He told her the rest. Serena's contact with federal investigators. The proffer. What Diane had said that morning. What the next 24 hours required. He told her about the men watching the building, her building, and why they were there. And he watched her take that in with the stillness of someone absorbing information that was frightening but not surprising, someone who had already braced for worse. She pulled my address, Elena said. Yes. Does she know about Daniel? He paused. I don't know what she knows. I'm not willing to assume she doesn't. Elena looked at the incubator, at Daniel. Her jaw set in a way he recognized, a way that had nothing soft in it. Fix it, she said, not pleading, instructing. Whatever you have to do, however it has to happen, fix it. Because he is not growing up looking over his shoulder because of something that started before he existed. I know. I'm not asking you to fix it for me. I'm asking you to fix it for him. Her eyes stayed on the incubator. There's a difference. I know that too, he said quietly. He left Portland 2 hours later. He kissed Daniel's incubator, not Daniel's face, because the glass was between them, and he wasn't going to ask the nurses to open it for a gesture. He just put his hand flat on the warm surface and stayed there for a moment. Elena watched him do it. She didn't say anything. At the door, he turned back. Rachel is staying? He said. Rachel is staying. I have 2 people outside the building. They're mine. If anything feels wrong, I know how to reach you, she said. He nodded. He left. I was back in Chicago by late afternoon, and the city felt different now, the way places feel different when you return to them carrying something heavier than what you left with. He went directly from the airport to Diane's office, where she and 2 associates had spent the morning building the voluntary disclosure package. It was a significant document, 53 pages of financial analysis, transaction records, authentication trails, and reconstructed communication logs that demonstrated, with the kind of forensic clarity that took real expertise to assemble, that the unauthorized transfers in the Eastern accounts had been designed and executed by Serena Vale using Luca's authorization credentials, which she had obtained through her administrative access over a period of 26 months. It also included, as an addendum, records of Serena's proffer contact with the federal office obtained through channels that Diane preferred not to specify in any written document, which demonstrated that she had initiated contact with investigators while simultaneously conducting the internal organizational power play. This is enough, Luca said, going through it at the table. It's enough to change the narrative. Diane sat across from him. It positions you as a victim of internal fraud who came forward proactively. It does not make your other exposures disappear, but it makes you a cooperating party instead of a primary target, and it makes Serena the primary subject of the fraud investigation instead of you. When do we file? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I've arranged a meeting with the lead investigator on the Financial Crimes Unit. His name is Reyes. He's thorough and he's not corrupt, which matters. And tonight you stay here and you do not contact Serena or anyone in her circle. Diane looked at him over her glasses. Can you do that? Yes? Because if she gets wind of what's coming, I won't contact her. He closed the document. What's her timeline on the proffer formalization? My read is 48 hours, possibly less if she has reason to accelerate. So we're moving first. By approximately 12 hours, if everything holds. If. That word sat in the room like something alive. Marco called at 7 in the evening. Luca was in a hotel room 3 blocks from Diane's office, sitting on the edge of the bed with his jacket still on, because he had sat down for a moment and hadn't found a reason to move yet. Caruso made a move, Marco said. Luca straightened. What kind of move? He called a meeting, tonight. 6 of the division heads, 2 of the financial controllers, the Eastern Territory managers. He's presenting the same documentation Serena showed him and framing it as evidence of mismanagement at the top. He's positioning himself as the stability candidate. A pause. He's doing it tonight because he knows you're not in the city. He thinks you're still in Portland. Who told him I was in Portland? Marco was quiet for a moment. That's the question. Because Caruso had not been in the NICU conversation. Caruso had not been in Diane's office. The only people who knew Luca had gone to Portland were Marco, Diane, and the two men outside Elena's building, and Rachel and Elena herself. One of my people? Luca said. I don't think so, but I'm looking at it. Or Serena has coverage I haven't found yet. That's my current assumption. Luca stood up and put his jacket back properly. Can Caruso be stopped? Not without showing your hand. Then let him meet. He was already moving. Let him make his case to those men tonight. By tomorrow morning, the documentation he's presenting will be publicly contextualized as part of a fraud that someone other than me orchestrated. Caruso becomes the man who held a meeting based on forged evidence. A pause. And if he knew it was forged, then he's Serena's man and we handle it accordingly, Marco said. But we need tomorrow morning to happen first. It will happen. He said it with more certainty than he entirely felt. Keep those men from making any formal commitments tonight. Can you do that? I can reach Benedetti. He'll hold. One is enough to break a consensus. Get to Benedetti. He ended the call and stood in the hotel room and pressed both hands against the window and looked at the city below. Chicago at night. The specific density of its light, the way it pressed upward against the dark. He had grown up looking at this skyline and believing it was his to protect, his to navigate, his to eventually leave in better shape than he found it. He had believed that about the organization too, for a long time, that it was inherited but could be improved, that power was manageable if you were serious about managing it. He had been wrong about that. Not entirely, but enough. It took Daniel, 5 weeks early, small enough to fit in a palm, wired to monitors in a hospital in Portland, to make that clear in a way nothing else had managed to. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He answered anyway because he was past the point of not answering unknown numbers. Mr. Romano, a man's voice, measured, professional. My name is Reyes. I'm the lead investigator on the Financial Crimes Unit. I understand we have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. A pause. I'm calling tonight because something's changed. Luca said nothing. He waited. Serena Vale's attorney contacted us 4 hours ago to accelerate the proffer timeline. They're claiming their client has time-sensitive evidence that will be compromised if we don't formalize the agreement by midnight tonight. Another pause, and in the pause something that might have been calculation, a man deciding how much to say. I'm calling you because I'm a thorough person. Before I finalize an agreement with someone claiming to have evidence against you, I want to know whether you have something that changes my assessment of who is bringing what to this table. The window glass was cold under his hands. I have 53 pages, Luca said, and I can have them in your hands in 40 minutes. Silence on the other end. Brief. My office, Reyes said. Not tomorrow. Now. Luca was out of the hotel room in 90 seconds. He called Diane from the elevator. She picked up immediately, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. Reyes called me, he said. He wants the package tonight. Can you be at his office in 40 minutes? A beat. I'll be there in 30. Diane, I heard you. 30 minutes. Go. The meeting with Reyes lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes and took place in a federal building conference room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee and the particular atmosphere of rooms where serious things happen at serious hours. Reyes was a man in his mid-50s with the build of someone who had once been athletic and was now just solid, and he had the manner of someone who made his assessments early and held them firmly but was genuinely capable of revising them when the evidence required it. He went through Diane's package methodically. He asked questions that were specific and occasionally uncomfortable. He had a colleague present, a financial crimes analyst named Wakefield, who didn't speak much but who read through the transaction documentation with the focused intensity of someone who was very good at this particular kind of reading. At 11:47, Reyes looked up from the last page. The proffer from Vale's attorney is sitting on my desk, he said. She's been feeding us information for 8 months. Some of it has been useful. Some of it was designed to be useful, Luca said. The pieces that pointed toward me. I'm aware that's your position. Reyes's voice was neutral. Not hostile, just careful. What I'm looking at now is documentation that, if it holds up to forensic verification, and we'll spend the next week determining whether it does, suggests the transaction architecture was constructed by someone else using your credentials. He paused. Which would mean the material she's been providing us has been selectively curated to exclude her own role. That's correct. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. You understand that voluntary cooperation doesn't make your other exposures disappear. My attorney has explained that. You understand what you're inviting when you sit in this room. I understand exactly what I'm inviting. Luca held his gaze. I'm doing it anyway. Another pause. Why? Reyes said. Not as a legal question, as something more direct. Luca thought about a hospital room in Portland. Small hands. Monitors. A paper coffee cup on the floor beside a chair. Because I have a son, he said. And I'd like him to know his father was the kind of man who told the truth when it cost him something. Reyes looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his pen. All right, he said. Let's start from the beginning. They were 3 hours into the preliminary cooperation discussion when Luca's phone buzzed on the table. He had it face down. He had kept it face down for 3 hours because Diane had told him to, because walking out of this room to take a call was the kind of thing that made federal investigators reassess their instinct to trust you. It buzzed again. And again. He flipped it over. 3 missed calls from Marco. A text message that said 4 words. Portland. Now. Rachel calling. His chair scraped back. Reyes looked up. Diane looked up. Wakefield didn't look up from his documents. I need 5 minutes, Luca said. He was in the corridor before Reyes could respond, and he had Marco on the phone before he reached the end of it. Tell me, he said. One of my men outside the building called in 10 minutes ago. Marco's voice had the stripped-down quality, the emergency quality. A car, 2 men. They parked across the street 40 minutes ago, and they've been watching the building entrance. Not surveillance, positioned. My man recognized one of them. He's connected to Caruso. Luca's hand tightened on the phone. They haven't gone in? Not yet. But my man thinks they're waiting for something, a signal, a timing window. He doesn't know. He pulled back so they wouldn't make him. A pause. Luca, if they go in that building, they won't. You're 2,000 miles away. They won't go in. He was already walking back toward the conference room. I need you to call your man and tell him to take the car out of play. Not the men. The car. Flat tire, disabled, whatever is cleanest. Make it impossible to leave quickly. And the men themselves? They're not going anywhere without their exit route. By the time they figure out another option, I need Chicago resolved enough that Caruso has no reason to send them in. Luca, how long do I have? Marco breathed. An hour, maybe less. He went back into the conference room. Reyes looked at him with the assessment of a man who was reading the room carefully. Everything all right? He said. I need to accelerate this, Luca said. He sat down. Whatever you need from me in the next 60 minutes, I'll give it to you. Full cooperation, no conditions. But I need this conversation to reach a formal preliminary agreement before midnight. Reyes and Wakefield exchanged a look. That's aggressive, Reyes said. I'm aware. He looked at Reyes directly. There are people connected to the individual who is trying to frame me who are currently outside a building in Portland where my 8-day-old son and his mother are tonight. I need this to be formal enough that when I call the people who sent them and tell them it's over, they believe me. The conference room was very quiet. Reyes put down his pen, picked it up again. Wakefield, he said, without looking away from Luca. Get the preliminary agreement template. Wakefield stood and left the room. Diane, who had been sitting with her hands folded for the last 30 seconds, met Luca's eyes across the table. She gave him a single, small nod, the kind that meant, you did the right thing, this is going to cost you, and it was still the right thing. He nodded back. At 12:23 in the morning, Luca Romano signed a preliminary cooperation agreement with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. It was not a complete resolution. It was not immunity. It was the beginning of a long, costly, genuinely complicated process that would take the better part of a year and require him to open every corner of the Romano organization to legal scrutiny. It would mean the organization as it had existed was over, not gradually dismantled, but formally dissolved under legal oversight. He signed it without hesitation. He was outside with his phone at 12:26. Marco picked up instantly. It's done, Luca said. Call Caruso. Call him now, tonight, and tell him that Luca Romano signed a cooperation agreement with federal investigators 45 minutes ago, and that the documentation he has been presenting to the division heads tonight was prepared by Serena Vale and will be identified in federal proceedings as fraudulent evidence she constructed to cover her own crimes. He paused. Tell him that anyone who remains loyal to her position at this point becomes a co-subject of the investigation. Tell him I said so. Silence on Marco's end. Then, you actually did it. Call him. Luca Marco. The men outside the building in Portland. Call Caruso first, then call your man and tell him to stand down and confirm the threat is resolved. He stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building in the cold, his breath visible in the dark air. In that order. Yes. A pause. Okay. Yes. He ended the call and stood very still on the sidewalk for a moment, somewhere in a building in Portland, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Daniel Romano was in an incubator breathing on his own more strongly than he had 3 days ago. Elena was in the chair beside him. Rachel was somewhere nearby. 2 men were sitting in a car across the street from that building, waiting for a signal from a man who was about to receive a phone call that would make that signal impossible. His phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. 2 words. They left. He stood on the sidewalk with his eyes closed for exactly 5 seconds. Then he called Diane. The preliminary agreement, he said. What does this mean for Serena's proffer? It means she walked into that office tomorrow morning to formalize a cooperation agreement and instead finds herself being interviewed as a primary subject. Diane's voice was measured, but there was something satisfied underneath it, the satisfaction of a woman who had spent 30 years doing this and still found it genuinely meaningful when the right thing happened. Her documentation becomes evidence against her instead of against you. Her 8 months of curated information looks like what it is, a carefully constructed misdirection. A pause. She's not going to walk away from this cleanly, Luca. I know. Neither are you entirely. I know that too. He looked up at the Chicago skyline, the light pressing up into the dark, the way it always had. Diane, he said. Yes. Is it enough? What I did tonight. Is it enough to keep them safe? A pause. Not long, but real. It's enough to change the trajectory, she said. The rest of it depends on what you do next. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood there another moment in the cold, in the specific silence of a city at 1 a.m. when the noise had pulled back and left something raw underneath. He had signed away the empire his father built and his grandfather before him. He had handed the shape of everything he'd inherited to a federal office and said, take what you need, examine what you find, and let the rest go. He had made himself, in a single signature, the most exposed he had ever been. And standing on that sidewalk, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not peace, not relief, nothing that clean, but something underneath both of those, something older and more fundamental, the specific bone-deep sensation of a man who has stopped running from the right decision and finally, at considerable cost, simply made it. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Elena. He stood there for 1 full second with the phone ringing in his hand and the night air cold against his face, and the city behind him, and everything he had just done still settling into the shape of what came next. And then he answered it. I saw the news alert, she said. Her voice was not warm. Not yet. But it was there. Present. Real. Federal Cooperation Agreement. Romano Organization. A pause. That was you. Yes. Another pause. Longer. Daniel is breathing better tonight, she said. The doctor said if it keeps going the way it's going, he might be off the monitors by the end of the week. Luca pressed the phone harder against his ear. That's good, he said. His voice did the thing again, the thing at the edges he couldn't fully control. That's really good, Elena. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, come back when you can. Not I forgive you. Not everything is fine. Not even I want you here. Just come back when you can. It was the most important thing anyone had ever said to him. And the war wasn't over. Serena was still out there. Caruso was still out there. The legal process was just beginning and would consume years of his life and resources he hadn't yet fully counted. But in that moment, standing on a sidewalk in Chicago at 1:30 in the morning, with Elena's voice in his ear and his son breathing more steadily 4 states away, Luca Romano understood with total clarity that the only battle that had ever actually mattered was the one he had just begun to find his way back from losing. The rest of it was just the work. Serena Vale did not go quietly. That was the thing people who hadn't dealt with her before would not have anticipated, but Luca had understood from the moment he signed the cooperation agreement that the hours between that signature and her formal interview with Reyes's office would be the most dangerous ones. A woman who had spent 4 years building a machine doesn't watch it dismantle without trying every remaining lever. She was too disciplined for panic and too intelligent for denial, which made her more dangerous in defeat than most people were at full strength. She made her move at 6 in the morning. Luca was in Diane's office, 2 hours into what would become a 12-hour day of preliminary legal documentation, when Marco called with the specifics. Serena had contacted 3 of the Eastern Division heads overnight. Not Caruso, who had gone silent after Marco's call, but 3 others who had not yet been in any room where the situation had been explained. She had told them, simply and without apparent urgency, that Luca had signed a cooperation agreement that named them as subjects of federal inquiry, and that their best option was to formalize their own separation from the organization before the investigation formally opened. It was, Luca reflected, an elegant move, not a last-ditch one, a considered one. She was trying to accelerate the organizational collapse in a way that created maximum legal chaos before the fraud documentation could be formally processed. If enough people lawyered up simultaneously and made individual deals with the investigators, the structure of the cooperation narrative became harder to control, and her role in constructing the fraud became one competing story among many, rather than the central finding. "She's trying to flood the zone," Diane said when Luca told her. "Can she?" "She can create noise. Whether the noise rises to the level of actual interference depends on how quickly Reyes can get the forensic verification on the transaction documentation." Diane was already at her keyboard. "I'm calling his office now. We need the verification expedited." "How expedited?" "Hours, not days." She was already dialing. "Go get coffee. This part isn't something you can affect by being in the room." He got coffee. He stood by the window of Diane's office with a cup he barely tasted and watched the city wake up below. And he thought about Serena in whatever room she was in making those calls. And he felt something that surprised him by its clarity. Not rage, not satisfaction, not the cold operational detachment he usually kept around difficult situations. What he felt was tired. Genuinely, thoroughly tired, in the way that comes not from lack of sleep but from the accumulated weight of understanding fully, finally, the cost of every decision that led to this particular morning. Diane was on the phone for 40 minutes. When she hung up, she turned to him with the expression of someone delivering news that was neither good nor bad, but simply the facts on the ground. "Reyes moved the forensic team up," she said. "They've been working through the night, actually. He anticipated she'd try something. The preliminary verification on the transaction architecture is done. It's consistent with what our documentation shows." She sat down. "He's opening her formal interview this morning, not as a cooperating witness, as a subject." Luca set his coffee cup down. "It's done?" he said. "The fraud piece is done enough. The rest of it, your cooperation, the organizational dissolution, the legal process, that's a year of work, minimum. But the specific danger she posed, the frame she built?" Diane looked at him steadily. "That's done." He nodded. He stood there for a moment, absorbing the specific texture of that. Done. Not clean, not easy, not without enormous costs still to come. But the machine Serena had built was now running in reverse, and the person standing in front of it was her. "I need to go back to Portland," he said. Diane looked at him over her glasses. "The legal process is going to need you here for—" "I know. I'll be back in 2 days. I need to go back first." He picked up his jacket. "The rest of this can be done by phone and document. The thing I need to do next has to be in person." She didn't argue with that. He was on a noon flight. Serena Vale's formal interview with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit began at 9:17 that same morning and lasted 6 hours. Her attorney attempted to reframe the session as a continuation of the proffer process 3 times. Reyes redirected it 3 times. By the afternoon, her attorney had requested a recess that turned into a suspension of the interview pending further legal consultation, which was the specific kind of language that meant the person in the interview chair had understood that the room had changed shape around them and needed time to recalibrate. The recalibration didn't produce anything useful for Serena. The forensic verification was thorough and it was damning, and it had the specific quality of evidence that becomes more coherent. The harder you look at it rather than less. The kind that had been constructed by someone careful and was being dismantled by people who were equally careful and had the institutional resources to be patient about it. She was formally named as a subject of investigation by the end of that week. Her attorney issued a statement. It said the expected things. Luca didn't read it. He was in Portland when it was issued, sitting on the floor of the NICU because the chair had been occupied by a nurse doing a check, and he had simply sat down where he was, and Daniel was looking at him. Not looking in any sophisticated sense. Daniel was 11 days old, and his visual processing was in its earliest stages, and what he was perceiving was almost certainly just light and shadow and the vague warmth of presence. But his eyes were open, and they were pointing in Luca's direction, and the small, unsteady focus of them felt to Luca, like the most significant thing he had ever been on the receiving end of. "Hey," he said quietly, because the NICU had its own ambient sound and he didn't need to be loud. "I know you don't know who I am yet. That's fair. I'm going to spend a long time fixing that." Daniel's eyes moved slightly. His hand, resting against the incubator padding, made a small random movement that was entirely physiological and had no intentionality behind it, but that Luca found himself cataloging with an attention he had previously reserved for things that were trying to take something from him. "I'm your father," Luca said. "I know that sounds simple. It's not simple. But it's the truest thing I have right now, so that's where we start." Elena appeared at the door behind him. She had gone for food, her first actual sit-down meal since Daniel had arrived, which Rachel had engineered by simply removing the chair from the room and the coffee cup from the floor, and standing in the doorway until Elena agreed to go to the cafeteria. She stood in the doorway now, with a wrapped sandwich she was working through without much enthusiasm, and watched Luca on the floor talking to their son. She watched him for a long moment before she said anything. "The floor is cold," she said finally. "I know. There's a chair available now. I'm fine here." She came in and sat in the chair and unwrapped more of the sandwich, and they were quiet together in the way they had been in the first days. Not comfortable exactly, but not actively uncomfortable either. Something in between, which was its own kind of progress. "Diane called me," Elena said. He looked up. "About the investigation?" "About what you signed, what you gave up." She was looking at the sandwich rather than at him. "She wasn't supposed to, I think. I think she just wanted me to know, because she thought I might not understand the scale of it otherwise." A pause. "She's protective of you. In a way you probably don't notice because you're used to it." "Diane's protective of outcomes," he said. "I'm an outcome she's invested in. Don't dismiss it." Elena looked up at him. "People being protective of you matters. You should let it matter." He held her gaze for a moment. "Okay." She looked back down at the sandwich. "You gave up everything." "Not everything." "The organization, the empire, everything your family built for 3 generations." "Yes. And you did it in one night. It was the right thing to do." He said it without drama, without the weight of a man expecting to be credited for it. Just a statement. It should have been done differently, and earlier, and for better reasons. The fact that I did it at the right moment doesn't make the preceding years of not doing it something to be proud of. Elena was quiet for a moment. "You're not making this easy for me," she said. Not angrily, something more complicated than that. "I'm not trying to make it anything." He looked at Daniel. "I'm not here to convince you of something. I'm here because you told me to come back and because Daniel is here, and because I have a very long road in front of me, and I'd rather start walking it in the right direction than waste time managing impressions." Elena was quiet for a while after that. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. Daniel's hand moved again, that random physiological movement that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. "I'm not forgiving you," Elena said. "Not yet. I want you to know that. Not because I don't, not because everything is still exactly as it was, but because I'm not doing something this significant on 11 days of sleep deprivation and postpartum hormones and the residue of a crisis. I'm going to take the time I need, and I need you to understand that's not a punishment. I understand that. And I need you to understand that my priority is him. Whatever happens between you and me, and I don't know what that looks like yet, I genuinely don't know. He is the first thing, always. He's the first thing for me too. She looked at him, really looked, in the way she used to when she was trying to determine whether something he said was the performed version or the actual one. I know, she said. That's the part that makes this complicated. He almost smiled. Not quite. Yeah. She finished the sandwich. She put the wrapper in the bin. She put her hand through the incubator portal and rested her fingers against Daniel's arm, the automatic, constant reassurance of it. And she said without looking at Luca, "There's a hotel 2 blocks from here. Rachel got you a room." A pause. "You should sleep." He stood up from the floor slowly because his legs had gotten colder than he'd realized. "I'll be back in the morning." "I know you will," she said. He left without touching her. He wanted to, and he didn't because the not yet she had given him was real, and he intended to treat it as such. He went to the hotel and he slept for 9 hours straight, which was the most he had slept since November. Serena Vale's criminal case took 14 months to fully develop. She was charged on 6 counts related to financial fraud, 2 counts related to the manipulation of federal evidence, and 1 count related to the coordination of witness intimidation, that last one stemming from the men outside Elena's building in Portland, who had both agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced exposure and who had provided, without much resistance, the chain of instruction that led directly back to Serena. Her attorney mounted a defense that was technically sophisticated and ultimately insufficient. The forensic documentation was too thorough. The cooperation of too many peripheral parties, Curtis, Petra, the 2 men from Portland, 3 more figures who had been on the edges of her operation and chose the better option when it was presented, assembled into a picture that was difficult to argue around. She was convicted on 4 of the 6 fraud counts, and both evidence-related counts, and acquitted on the intimidation charge on a technicality related to jurisdiction that her attorney had correctly identified as the weakest link in the prosecution's case. She did not go to prison without one last attempt at leverage. 2 months before the verdict, her attorney sent Diane Holt a communication that proposed, in carefully legal language, that Serena would be willing to provide documentation related to the Romano organization's historical operations, documentation she claimed to have been accumulating as insurance for years, in exchange for a negotiated sentence. Diane brought it to Luca. He read it. He sat with it for a moment. "She's saying she has material on the organization's operations," Diane said, "independent of what you've already disclosed. If she has it and it's real, it complicates the cooperation framework we've built. What does she actually want? Home confinement instead of custodial time, and immunity from any future civil suits related to the fraud." Luca put the document down. "She burned 4 years building a trap, and she's still trying to negotiate from inside it." "She's consistent," Diane said, with the dry exhaustion of someone who had been dealing with consistent people for 30 years. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing." He pushed the document back. "She has historical organizational material. It's because she collected it specifically as a weapon, and she's trying to use it as one last time. I've already disclosed everything I'm disclosing. If there are things in her files that the investigators want, they can subpoena her for them." He paused. "She gets no deal from me. Whatever she has, she built it for herself, not for leverage she's entitled to use." Diane nodded. "That's what I thought you'd say. Is that a problem?" "Legally, no. She can try to sell what she has to the investigators directly, but without our cooperation in offering a deal, the incentive structure changes." A brief pause. "She'll probably try, and it will probably not produce the outcome she's hoping for." It didn't. The investigators reviewed what Serena offered and found that the majority of it was duplicative of what Luca had already disclosed, organized, as Luca had suspected, by someone who had been cataloging others' actions for use as weapons, rather than for any genuine interest in accountability. The parts that weren't duplicative related to historical operations that the cooperation framework had already addressed. There was nothing new. There was no deal. She received a sentence of 6 years. Her attorney had the jurisdiction acquittal and several mitigating factors that reduced the initial sentencing recommendation. But 6 years was what the judge determined was appropriate, and Serena stood in that courtroom and received it with the same composed, unreadable expression she had maintained throughout the trial. Not defiant, not broken, simply contained. the expression of someone who had made a very large calculation and was absorbing the cost of its failure without external commentary. Luca was not in the courtroom. He had not attended any part of the trial. Diane had asked him whether he wanted to be there for the verdict, and he had thought about it for a genuinely long moment before saying no. "It's not about not caring," he told her. "It's about where I want to be when it's over." He was in Portland. Daniel was 7 months old. The NICU was months behind them. Daniel had come home to Elena's apartment, the third-floor one that still smelled like old radiator heat. At 6 weeks, small and fierce, and making demands at 2-hour intervals, with the comprehensive self-confidence of someone who had no information yet about how the world was organized and therefore no reason to be modest about his needs. Luca had a rental apartment 4 blocks away. He had found it the week Daniel came home, because Elena had told him, carefully, clearly, without cruelty, that they were not at a place where living together made sense, and that Daniel needed stability and consistency, and that stability and consistency could be provided by a father who showed up every day without requiring that showing up to mean something it didn't yet mean. He showed up every day. It was not always comfortable. There were mornings when he arrived and Elena was short with him because she was exhausted and he was the person available to be short with, and he absorbed that without comment because he had no standing to take it personally, and because she was raising their son on 4 hours of sleep and deserved the latitude. There were evenings when he left and sat in his rental apartment and felt the full weight of the 4 blocks between them, the specific distance between where he was and where he wanted to be, and he sat with that weight without trying to resolve it prematurely. He had learned, slowly, what it meant to wait for something you couldn't control. He had not found it easy. He was not a man built for waiting. He had spent his adult life in environments where patience was a tactic rather than a genuine state, where you waited for the right moment not because you had made peace with uncertainty, but because timing was a form of pressure. This was different. This waiting had no tactical dimension. It was simply what Elena needed, and what Daniel needed, and those were the only 2 things that mattered. Rachel stayed for 3 months, which was longer than she had originally planned, and she left with the specific reluctance of someone who has been essential and knows it, and is trying to become slightly less essential for everyone's good. Her last evening in Portland, she had dinner with Luca and Elena and Daniel at Elena's apartment, takeout on the floor, because Daniel was in the activity stage where he needed to be on the floor to practice being interested in objects, and they had accommodated him. And Rachel sat across from Luca and looked at him with the direct assessment she had always given him, the one that didn't soften for politeness. "You're different," she said. "People keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She picked up Daniel and held him against her shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 3 months getting very good at this. "You used to take up the room differently, like you were managing it." "I probably was. You're not doing that now." "I'm trying not to." He looked at Elena, who was looking at Daniel with the expression she wore almost all the time now, that particular, unreserved tenderness that she had never quite shown him in 5 years, and was now showing their son without any filter at all, which he found not painful exactly, but clarifying. It told him something about what she had always been capable of when she felt completely safe. "I have very few rooms I'm managing anymore." Rachel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. "How does that feel?" He thought about it. Like standing outside in cold air, after a long time inside. Rachel looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Elena. Something passed between the sisters that he couldn't fully read, the specific communication of 2 people who know each other better than they know themselves. And then Rachel handed Daniel back to his mother and said, "Okay, I think you're going to be fine." She wasn't saying it to Luca. She was saying it to Elena. Elena took Daniel and settled him against her chest and said, "I know." Rachel left the next morning. Luca drove her to the airport, which she had not asked for but accepted, and at the departure's drop-off. She got out of the car and then turned back and said through the window, "Don't screw it up, not because of what it would do to you, because of what it would do to her." "I know," he said. She nodded. She left. The legal process in Chicago ran for the better part of a year and involved more documentation than Luca had produced in the preceding decade of running the organization, and flew back regularly, sometimes weekly during the intensive periods, and spent long days in Diane's office and in federal conference rooms and in meetings with the accountants overseeing the formal asset dissolution. The Romano organization was dismantled methodically, the way you take apart something that was built to last. Carefully, with attention to what each piece connected to, making sure that nothing came down in a way that crushed something adjacent. There were former associates who were angry. There were some who felt betrayed. Marco, who could have been among them, chose differently. Chose to be present through the dissolution in a quiet, practical way that asked for nothing in return. Because Marco was a man who understood that 19 years of loyalty didn't have to become 19 years of resentment just because the thing you'd been loyal to had changed shape. He started a legitimate security consulting business 18 months after the cooperation agreement. Small. Deliberately small. 4 people at the start, himself included, working with corporate clients on risk assessment and security architecture. He had been good at understanding where vulnerabilities lived inside complex systems. It turned out that skill transferred, and transferred cleanly, into a context where no one was being hurt by the application of it. He did not advertise his past. He did not hide it either. Anyone who researched him found what there was to find, and the clients who were comfortable with the full picture of who he had been and what he had done to change it were the clients he wanted. The ones who weren't didn't become clients, and he didn't lose sleep over that. He rebuilt slowly, in a way he had never built anything before, without shortcuts, without leverage, without the background pressure of an organization providing a current beneath everything. It was slower. It was harder in certain ways. He found, to his own occasional surprise, that he preferred it. The consulting work was based in Portland, which had not been an accident. Elena noticed. She didn't comment on it directly for a long time. Then one evening, when Daniel was nearly 8 months old and had recently discovered the ability to pull himself to standing against furniture, and was deploying this ability with the obsessive repetition of someone who has found the most interesting thing in the world, she said, while watching him do it for approximately the 14th time. "You moved the business here." "Yes." "The business didn't need to be here. Your clients are mostly in Chicago and New York." "I have video calls." She looked at him. "Luca." "I wanted to be here," he said, simply. "I can run it from here. I'm going to run it from here." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Daniel, who had pulled himself up again and was looking around with the particular expression of a person who has achieved a goal and is already looking for the next one. "Okay," she said, the same word she had used in the NICU, a long time ago, when she wasn't ready to forgive him but was willing to let him be present. But it meant something different now. The texture of it had changed. It had weight in it that the earlier version hadn't had yet. He didn't push. He let it be what it was. The day the trial ended, the day Serena's sentence was handed down, Luca was in a park 4 blocks from Elena's apartment with Daniel. It was a Saturday in early spring, the specific spring day that Portland produces occasionally, that is so clear and still and warm that it feels almost like an apology for the gray months preceding it. Daniel was 9 months old and had recently added walking, unsteady, lurching, falling, and getting up walking, to his operational capabilities, and he was in the process of investigating a section of grass with the methodical intensity of a person conducting a survey. Luca was sitting on a bench watching him, just watching. Not on his phone, not mentally somewhere else, not doing the partial presence that had characterized so much of his life before, the being in a room while actually being several rooms ahead. Just here, just watching Daniel negotiate the grass. Elena sat down beside him. She had come from behind him. He had heard her, recognized her footsteps without turning, and she sat down and they watched Daniel together in the quiet of the park for a moment before either of them spoke. She had a coffee. She was wearing the gray sweatshirt again, the one he'd first seen in the NICU, which had become a regular garment, because Daniel had apparently decided it was acceptable for drool, and she had stopped defending it. "It's over," she said. "I saw the notification." "Yes." 6 years. "Yes." She curled both hands around her coffee and looked at Daniel, who had found something in the grass, a leaf, probably, or a small stick, and was examining it with appropriate gravity. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it, not as a deflection, as a genuine assessment. "Glad it's resolved. Not glad in the way I thought I would be when I imagined this being over." He paused. "When you spend a long time moving towards something, sometimes actually reaching it just feels like a change in the weather, not a celebration, just the next thing." Elena nodded slowly. I'm not going to spend time thinking about her, he said. I thought maybe I would. I thought there'd be something I'd want to say or feel or resolve somehow, internally. But I don't actually need to resolve anything about her. What she did is what she did. It's over. I'd rather spend whatever thinking I have left on things that are still going. Elena turned to look at him. He felt it before he turned to meet it. What's still going? She said. He met her eyes. Everything I'm looking at right now. She held his gaze for a long moment. Daniel, across the grass, sat down abruptly in the way he sometimes did. Not falling, exactly, just deciding that standing was no longer the priority. And then looked back at them with the unself-conscious directness of a 9-month-old who has spotted something familiar and interesting. Da, he said. It was not his first word. His first word had been Rachel's name, which Rachel had found enormously gratifying and which Elena had found mostly funny. But this was different. This was aimed. This was Daniel on the grass looking at his father and producing a sound that meant something. Luca felt it go through him like a current. He stood up from the bench and crossed the grass and crouched down in front of his son, and Daniel reached up and grabbed his nose with the imprecision and conviction of someone who has not yet learned that this is not a socially standard greeting, and Luca laughed. The real one, the unguarded one that Elena had heard in a corridor on a Tuesday night and had believed meant something terrible, and that now, in a park in early spring, meant only what it actually was. Elena watched from the bench. Her hands were around her coffee. Her expression was doing the complicated thing again, the thing that had several layers running simultaneously, but the layer on top was something simpler than what had been there for a long time. She stood up. She walked across the grass. She crouched down beside them, on Daniel's other side, and Daniel immediately redirected his grabbing to her hair, and she made the automatic sound of someone who has experienced this many times and still finds it equally undignified every time. He does that constantly, she told Luca. I noticed. He thinks hair is a handle. He's efficient. She looked at Luca over Daniel's head, over the small, determined, imprecise energy of him between them, and something settled in her expression that had been in motion for a long time. Not resolved exactly, not the resolution of something that was ever going to be entirely resolved, but settled. The way a thing settles when it has found the position it can stay in. I'm not there yet, she said, quietly. Meaning you and me, the full weight of that. The version of it that existed before November and might exist again in some different form. I know. But She stopped, looked for the right word and picked one that was small and true rather than large and impressive. I'm closer. He nodded. She looked back at Daniel, who had now lost interest in hair and was attempting to stand again, using her shoulder for leverage. Don't expect a timeline, she said. I'm not expecting one. Because I don't have one. Elena. He waited until she looked at him. I'm not going anywhere. That's not a romantic declaration. It's what's true. I'm 4 blocks away and I'm here on Saturday and I'll be here on Sunday and I'm not counting anything or waiting for a specific outcome. I'm just here. He paused. That's all I've got, but I've got all of it. She looked at him for a long moment. Daniel, successfully standing now against her shoulder, made a sound of triumph that required no interpretation. Elena said nothing for a moment. Then she stood up and helped Daniel stay upright, and they were all 3 of them standing in the grass in the clear spring morning, and she said, not to Luca exactly, but not to herself either, just to the air between them. Okay. And that was enough for now. That was in fact more than enough. Because enough right now was real, and real was what they had, and real was the only thing that had ever been worth building toward in the first place. Luca Romano had spent 40 years believing that power was what you accumulated and protected. He had been wrong about that in the specific way that takes a long time to understand because the wrongness is so embedded in everything you've been taught that it looks like the floor rather than an assumption. The floor, it turned out, was not power. It was not empire or wealth or the particular fear in a room when you walked in. It was this. A 9-month-old standing in park grass. A woman who had been through enough to have every reason not to be here, and who was here anyway, in her gray sweatshirt with her coffee, being closer than she was yesterday, and not yet where she might be tomorrow. It was ordinary and impermanent and insufficient by any standard he had previously applied to his own life. He found it, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Watching his son try to eat a leaf while the woman he had never stopped loving stood 3 feet away being careful with both of them. He found it to be the most sufficient thing he had ever stood inside. The rest of his life began in exactly that moment, in the middle of a grass that asked nothing of him, in the company of people who were simply, stubbornly, still there. That was all. That was everything.